Montana Territory, 1885, a land where men's souls were bought and sold across poker tables stained with whiskey and blood, where family loyalty meant nothing when desperate greed took hold, and a young woman's fate could be decided by the turn of a marked card. For 17-year-old Cassandra Cass Sterling, her uncle's treacherous wager would deliver her into the hands of the most ruthless outlaw gang in the territory. But in this unforgiving wilderness, an unlikely savior, a half-Comanche scout carrying secrets as dark as his own mixed blood, would ignite a war that would shake the very foundations of corruption in the Montana Badlands. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The November wind cut through the mountains like a blade, carrying the scent of early snow and the promise of a brutal winter ahead. Cassandra Sterling pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders as she guided the pack mule down the treacherous trail toward Deadwood Gulch. At 17, she had learned to read the mountain weather as clearly as the ledger books she kept for her uncle's trading post, and every instinct screamed that they should have made this supply run weeks earlier. The trading post sat in a natural depression between two ridges, strategically positioned to catch travelers heading to and from the silver mines deeper in the territory. What had once been her father's dream of honest prosperity had become something far different under her uncle's management. Jeremiah Sterling had arrived 3 years ago, full of condolences for his brother's death in a mining accident and promises to care for his orphaned niece. The reality had proven far more complicated. Cass had grown accustomed to managing the post's daily operations, while Jeremiah spent increasingly long periods away on what he called business ventures. She suspected these ventures involved more gambling and drinking than legitimate trade, but as a woman with no legal standing and nowhere else to go, she kept her suspicions to herself. The arrangement worked, after a fashion. She maintained their modest livelihood while he provided the mail authority required by territorial law to maintain their property claims. The sound of horses approaching from behind made her turn in the saddle. 3 riders were gaining on her, their mounts moving with the easy gait of men accustomed to covering long distances. As they drew closer, Cass recognized the lead rider with a sinking heart. Bull Morrison, Jeremiah's gambling partner and the closest thing to a friend her uncle claimed in the territory. Morrison's presence usually meant trouble of one kind or another. "Miss Cass," Morrison called out as he drew alongside her mule. "Your uncle's been looking for you. Got some folks at the post want to discuss business." His tone carried an undercurrent that made her skin crawl. Morrison was a large man, thick through the chest and shoulders, with small, calculating eyes that seemed to constantly assess the value of everything they saw. His 2 companions, the Holloway brothers, were cut from similar cloth, rough men who lived in the gray areas between legitimate business and outright criminality. "What kind of business?" Cass asked, though she dreaded the answer. Morrison's version of business rarely benefited anyone except Morrison himself. He owned a ramshackle saloon in the nearest settlement and had been known to arrange various unsavory deals for travelers with more money than sense. "The profitable kind," Morrison replied with a grin that revealed yellowed teeth. "Come on, girl. Don't want to keep important folks waiting." The way he emphasized important sent a chill down Cass's spine that had nothing to do with the mountain wind. The trading post came into view as they crested the final ridge. Smoke rose from the chimney, and several horses were tied to the hitching post outside, more horses than Cass had ever seen there at one time. Her uncle stood on the front porch, his posture suggesting nervous agitation. Even from a distance, she could see the telltale signs of his drinking, the slightly unsteady stance, the overly careful movements of a man trying to appear sober as they approached. Cass noted the quality of the horses tied outside. These weren't the typical work animals of miners or traders. These were the mounts of men who could afford the best and needed speed when circumstances required it. The realization struck her like a physical blow. These were outlaw horses, fast, strong, bred for quick escapes and long pursuits. "Cassie girl," Jeremiah called out as she dismounted, his voice carrying forced cheerfulness, "come meet our guests. We're discussing a business proposition that could change our fortunes considerably." The men who emerged from the trading post's dim interior made Cassie's blood run cold. She had heard whispered descriptions of these faces in the settlements, seen their likenesses on wanted posters in sheriff's offices. The tall, lean man with the predatory smile was Marcus Blackjack Dalton, leader of the most feared outlaw gang in the territory. His pale blue eyes seemed to catalogue her features with the same calculating assessment she'd seen Morrison use on valuable merchandise. Beside him stood his lieutenant, a scarred Mexican named Carlos Vega, whose reputation for cruelty preceded him into every settlement from the Canadian border to Colorado. The remaining 3 men were clearly muscle, large, dangerous-looking individuals whose hands rested casually near their gun belts with the easy familiarity of frequent use. "Miss Sterling," Dalton said, removing his hat with exaggerated courtesy, "your uncle has been telling us fascinating stories about your capabilities. Managing the trading post, keeping the books, handling difficult customers. Quite impressive for someone so young." His smile never reached his cold eyes. Cass glanced at her uncle, noting the fine sheen of perspiration on his forehead despite the cool mountain air. "What kind of business are you gentlemen conducting?" she asked, though every instinct warned her to remain silent and invisible. "The profitable kind, as Morrison mentioned," Dalton replied, his tone conversational. "Your uncle owes me a considerable sum of money, Miss Sterling. We're discussing terms of repayment that would benefit everyone involved." Jeremiah's face had gone pale, confirming Cassie's worst fears. Her uncle's gambling had finally caught up with him, and these weren't the kind of men who accepted promises of future payment. "How much does he owe?" she asked quietly. $1,500, Dalton stated flatly. "Plus interest accumulated over the past 6 months. Your uncle has been creative in avoiding payment. The sum might as well have been $15,000. The trading post barely generated enough profit to maintain their modest lifestyle through the harsh mountain winters. There was no way they could raise such an amount, and everyone present knew it. However," Dalton continued, his pale eyes fixed on Cass with uncomfortable intensity, "your uncle has proposed an alternative arrangement, one that would clear his debt entirely and provide my organization with a valuable asset." The meaning of his words hit Cass like a physical blow. She turned to stare at her uncle, seeing guilt and desperation warring in his face. "Jeremiah," she whispered, "what have you done?" "Now, Cassie, hear them out," her uncle stammered. "It's not what you think. These gentlemen run a legitimate operation. They need someone with your skills to manage their business interests. You'd be well cared for, respected." "Respected." Vega spoke for the first time, his accented English carrying undertones of amusement. "See, the señorita would be very appreciated in our organization. We take good care of valuable assets." The way he emphasized appreciated made Cassie's skin crawl. She had heard enough stories about women who fell into the hands of outlaw gangs to understand exactly what her fate would be. The trading post, her father's legacy, would become a front for their operations, and she would become their property, in every sense of the word. "You can't be serious," she said, backing toward the door. "This is madness. The territorial marshals, the army, are very busy with other matters," Dalton interrupted smoothly. "And by the time they might become interested in our affairs, you'll be far from here, helping us establish new operations in more remote locations." Cass's mind raced through possibilities, all of them grim. Running was impossible. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. These men knew the territory better than she did, and winter was coming. Fighting was laughable. She was one 17-year-old girl against 5 armed men. Appealing to law enforcement would take days, assuming she could even reach them, and there was no guarantee they would arrive in time or be willing to confront. Dalton's gang. I need time to consider this, she said desperately. Surely such an important decision deserves careful thought. Dalton's smile widened, revealing teeth that reminded Cass uncomfortably of a wolf. I admire your spirit, Miss Sterling. It suggests you'll adapt well to your new circumstances. Unfortunately, time is a luxury we can't afford. Your uncle has already agreed to the arrangement. I haven't agreed to anything, Cass snapped, anger momentarily overcoming fear. I'm not property to be traded for gambling debts. Legally speaking, Morrison interjected with obvious satisfaction, your uncle is your guardian and has the right to make decisions regarding your welfare. The territorial courts would uphold such an arrangement, particularly given your family's precarious financial situation. The trap was perfectly constructed, Cass realized with growing despair. Her uncle's legal authority over her, their isolated location, the approach of winter, everything favored Dalton's position. Even if she could somehow escape, where would she go? A 17-year-old woman alone in the Montana wilderness faced prospects nearly as grim as whatever fate awaited her with the Outlaws. There is one alternative, Dalton said thoughtfully, as if the idea had just occurred to him. Your uncle could work off his debt through services to our organization. Of course, that would take considerable time, years most likely. And there would be significant personal risk involved. The kind of work we do doesn't offer guarantees of long-term health. The implied threat hung in the air. Accept the arrangement or watch her uncle die slowly in service to criminals. Cass looked at Jeremiah, seeing the man who had raised her for 3 years, flawed and weak, but the only family she had left. Despite his failures, despite the situation his gambling had created, she couldn't condemn him to death. How do I know you'll honor whatever agreement we make? She asked, grasping for any leverage. What's to stop you from taking what you want and killing us both? Business reputation, Dalton replied seriously. I've built my organization on reliability. When I make a deal, I keep it. Your uncle will remain here, managing the trading post as a legitimate front for our operations. You'll accompany us to help establish similar enterprises elsewhere. Both of you will be well treated as long as you prove useful. The word useful carried ominous implications, but Cass saw no alternatives. Every path led to disaster, and this arrangement at least offered the possibility that both she and her uncle might survive the experience. I want your word, she said desperately. Give me your oath that my uncle will be unharmed as long as he cooperates. Dalton placed his hand over his heart with theatrical solemnity. You have my word as a gentleman, Miss Sterling. Your uncle will live comfortably as long as he maintains his end of our arrangement. The ceremony felt like a funeral as they prepared for departure. Cass packed her few possessions into saddlebags, each item representing a piece of her life she was leaving behind forever. Her father's compass, her mother's Bible, the ledger books that represented 3 years of careful management, tangible connections to the person she had been before this nightmare began. Jeremiah stood in the doorway, watching her preparations, with the hollow eyes of a man who had sold his soul and found the price higher than expected. Cassie, he began, his voice breaking, I never meant for this to happen. The cards were running against me, and I thought I could win it all back. They always run against men like you, Uncle, Cass replied, without looking up from her packing. The house always wins, and men like Dalton are the house. "I'll find a way to get you back," he promised desperately. "I'll contact the marshals. Raise the money somehow." "No," Cass said firmly, finally meeting his eyes. "You'll do exactly what they tell you to do. You'll run the trading post, keep quiet about their business, and stay alive. If you try to be a hero now, we'll both end up dead." The wisdom in her words was painful but undeniable. Jeremiah nodded, slowly, understanding that his niece had become the adult in their relationship, making the hard decisions his weakness had forced upon them. As the sun began to set behind the western peaks, Dalton's gang prepared to leave. Cass mounted the horse they provided, a good animal, she noted with bitter irony, better than anything she had ever ridden. Even in their criminality, these men maintained certain standards. "Remember our arrangement, Sterling?" Dalton told her uncle as they prepared to depart. "The trading post operates normally. You report anything unusual to Morrison here. Any attempt to contact law enforcement or renege on our deal will have immediate consequences for your niece's welfare." As they rode away from the trading post, Cass looked back once at the only home she had known for 3 years. Jeremiah stood silhouetted in the doorway, a broken man watching his last connection to decency disappear into the gathering darkness. She wondered if she would ever see him again, and whether she would want to. The trail wound through increasingly wild terrain as night fell, leading deeper into the remote regions where law enforcement rarely ventured. Dalton's men knew the country well, following paths invisible to most travelers, stopping only when necessary to rest their horses. During one such stop, as the outlaws tended their mounts and planned their route, Cass found herself studying the vast wilderness surrounding them. Somewhere in this seemingly endless expanse of mountains and valleys, help might exist. Somewhere there might be someone willing to stand against men like Dalton and Morrison. The thought seemed laughably naive, but it was the only hope she had left. What she couldn't know was that help was already watching. From a ridge half a mile away, a lone figure observed their progress through field glasses, noting their number, their weapons, their direction of travel. The watcher was a man of mixed heritage, carrying the tracking skills of his Comanche mother and the tactical knowledge of his cavalry father. He had been following Dalton's gang for weeks, waiting for the right moment to strike. Tonight, seeing the young woman among the outlaws, that moment had arrived. The attack came at dawn, swift and silent as death itself. Cass woke to the sound of horses screaming and men shouting in confusion. The outlaw camp, which had seemed so secure in the darkness, erupted into chaos as gunfire split the morning air. She rolled from her bedroll behind the supply wagon where Dalton had ordered her to sleep, separated from the men, but close enough that escape would be impossible. Through the acrid gunsmoke, she glimpsed a figure moving with impossible speed through the scattered boulders above their camp. The mysterious attacker used the terrain like a weapon, appearing and disappearing among the rocks, each emergence marked by another precise shot that found its target. This wasn't random violence, it was surgical warfare conducted by someone who understood both the land and the men he was fighting. "Stay down, girl," Vega shouted, diving behind a fallen log as another bullet whined past his head. The scarred Mexican's usual confidence had evaporated, replaced by the wide-eyed panic of a predator suddenly finding himself prey. Dalton crouched behind his horse, using the animal as a shield while he tried to locate their attacker. "Whoever you are, show yourself," he bellowed into the morning silence. "We can make a deal." The response came not in words, but in action. A flaming arrow arced through the air, landing squarely in the center of their supply cache. The dried goods caught fire instantly, sending up a column of black smoke that would be visible for miles. Any hope of a quiet resolution to this encounter had literally gone up in smoke. "He's destroying our supplies!" Morrison yelled, emerging from behind a boulder with his rifle raised. "We've got to rush him." The moment Morrison broke cover, a rifle shot echoed across the canyon. The big man spun and fell, clutching his shoulder, his weapon tumbling into the rocks. The shot had been placed with surgical precision, disabling without killing, a mercy that seemed lost on the remaining outlaws. "This is madness," one of Dalton's men muttered, reloading his pistol with shaking hands. "Who fights like this? It's like he's dancing with us." Cass found herself studying the pattern of the attack with fascination rather than fear. Their mysterious assailant was herding the outlaws like cattle, forcing them into positions where they couldn't use their superior numbers effectively. Every shot, every movement served a tactical purpose that suggested military training combined with something far older and more intuitive. A new sound cut through the gunfire, the whistle of an arrow followed by a scream of pain. One of the remaining outlaws staggered backward, clutching at a shaft protruding from his thigh. The arrow had been placed to cripple, not kill, but the message was clear. Their attacker could have ended any of their lives at will. "Enough!" Dalton roared, standing fully upright with his hands raised. "What do you want? Money? Horses? Name your price." Silence stretched across the canyon like a held breath. And then from the rocks above, a voice spoke with quiet authority. "I want the girl. Send her up the trail, alone and unharmed. Do this, and you ride away with your lives." The voice carried the unmistakable accent of mixed heritage, the careful pronunciation of someone who had learned English as a second language, but spoke it with complete fluency. There was something else in that voice, an undercurrent of controlled fury that made even Dalton hesitate. "The girl isn't for trade," Dalton called back, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "She's payment for a debt, legitimate business." "Nothing about your business is legitimate." The response came from a different location, demonstrating that their attacker had moved again without being detected. Marcus Dalton, wanted for murder. In 3 territories, Carlos Vega escaped from the territorial prison at Deer Lodge. Your business involves theft, murder, and worse. "The girl comes with me." Cass felt a surge of hope mixed with uncertainty. Someone had come to help her, but who was this mysterious figure? And what would he want in return for her freedom? Her experience with men like Morrison and Dalton had taught her that few people acted without expecting something in return. "You know who we are," Dalton said, his tone turning calculating. "That means you've been watching us, following us. Why? What's your interest in our affairs?" Another arrow whistled through the air, this one embedding itself in the ground inches from Dalton's feet. Attached to the shaft was a piece of paper. With obvious reluctance, the outlaw leader retrieved it, unfolding what appeared to be a wanted poster. "Your paper on me is 6 months out of date," the voice called down. "The reward is now $3,000, dead or alive. I'm Sergeant Jacob Crow Feather, late of the 7th Cavalry, currently working as a territorial marshal's deputy. You're all under arrest." The name sent visible shock through the remaining outlaws. Cass had heard whispers of Crow Feather in the settlements, a half-breed scout who had earned a reputation for tracking down the territory's most dangerous criminals. Some said he was a ghost who could appear and disappear at will. Others claimed he had supernatural abilities inherited from his Comanche mother. The man calling to them from the rocks was very much alive, but his reputation for being nearly impossible to kill had apparently not been exaggerated. "A marshal's deputy," Vega spat, wincing as he shifted position behind his makeshift cover. "No wonder you fight like a coward, hiding in the rocks." "I fight smart," Crow Feather replied, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. "Something you might try if you live long enough to learn the lesson." Dalton was studying the tactical situation with the calculating mind that had kept him alive in a dangerous profession. Their attacker held the high ground, knew the terrain, and had already demonstrated superior marksmanship. The longer this standoff continued, the more likely it became that other law enforcement would arrive, drawn by the smoke from their burning. "Supplies? What guarantee do we have that you'll let us leave if we give you the girl?" Dalton asked. My word, Crowfeather replied simply, which is worth more than anything you've ever offered anyone. The simplicity of the statement carried more weight than elaborate promises would have. There was something in the man's voice that suggested he considered his word the most valuable thing he possessed. Marshall's deputies don't travel alone, Morrison said, struggling to bind his wounded shoulder with one hand. Where's your backup? Who says I'm alone? Crowfeather's voice now came from yet another position, demonstrating his continued movement through the rocks. Maybe I have a dozen men positioned around this canyon. Maybe I'm the advance scout for a full cavalry patrol. Or maybe I'm the only law within 50 miles, and I'm counting on your cowardice to avoid a fight you can't win. The psychological warfare was as effective as the physical attack had been. The outlaws found themselves glancing nervously at every shadow, every movement of wind through the sparse vegetation. Their confidence was cracking under the pressure of facing an opponent who seemed to anticipate their every move. Cass made her decision. Rising from behind the supply wagon, she called out toward the rocks. I'm coming up. Don't let them follow. Me, Cass, no! Dalton started forward, but froze as a rifle shot kicked up dirt at his feet. The girl makes her own choices. Crowfeather's voice carried clearly across the canyon. Anyone who tries to stop her answers to me. As Cass began walking toward the trail leading up into the rocks, she heard Dalton's voice behind her tight, with frustrated rage. This isn't over, girl. We know where to find your uncle. Cross us, and he pays the price. She paused, the threat hitting her like a physical blow. Her uncle's safety had been the only thing that made her cooperation with the outlaws tolerable. Now she faced an impossible choice, her freedom or Jeremiah's life. Keep walking. Crowfeather's voice came from directly ahead of her now, though she still couldn't see him. I heard his threat. We'll deal with that problem when the time comes. The trail wound upward through a maze of boulders and stunted pine trees, following a path that seemed to exist more in the mind of her guide than in any visible track. Cass climbed steadily, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Behind her, the voices of the outlaws grew fainter, but she knew they were watching, waiting for their chance to reclaim what they considered their property. She found him in a natural amphitheater formed by wind-carved stone, a place that commanded a perfect view of the canyon below while remaining invisible from the bottom. Jacob Crowfeather was not what she had expected. Certainly, he was tall and lean, with the long black hair and bronze skin that marked his mixed heritage. But his eyes held an intelligence and gentleness that seemed at odds with his fearsome reputation. Miss Sterling, he said, rising from where he had been checking his rifle, I apologize for the dramatic rescue, but those men don't respond to polite requests. He wore a combination of cavalry blue and buckskin with a silver star pinned to his shirt that marked his official status. His weapons were clean and well-maintained, and his equipment showed the care of a professional who understood that attention to detail meant the difference between life and death. How do you know my name? Cass asked, studying his face for any sign of the violence she had just witnessed. I've been tracking Dalton's gang for 3 weeks, Crowfeather explained, settling back into his observation position. When they visited your uncle's trading post, I was watching from the ridge. I saw what happened, heard the terms of their agreement. What they did to you and your family is illegal under territorial law, regardless of any debt your uncle might owe. But you're only one man, Cass said, sinking onto a flat rock beside him. How can you fight an entire gang? Crowfeather's smile was grim, but not without humor. I learned from the best teachers, cavalry tactics from my father, traditional warfare from my mother's people. The Comanche understand that a single warrior, properly positioned and equipped, can defeat a much larger force if he chooses his battles wisely. And you chose to make my rescue your battle. He was quiet for a long moment, his attention seemingly focused on the outlaws below. When he spoke, his voice carried undertones of old pain. My mother was sold to white slavers when I was 12 years old. I never saw her again. Some battles choose you, Miss Sterling. They become personal whether you want them to or not." The revelation explained the controlled fury she had heard in his voice during the fight. This wasn't just about law enforcement. For him, it was about preventing other families from being torn apart by the same kind of greed and violence that had destroyed his own. "What happens now?" Cass asked. "They'll never stop hunting me, and they meant what they said about my uncle." "Now we turn the tables," Crowfeather replied, his tone becoming businesslike. "Dalton's gang has been operating in this territory for 2 years, robbing banks, rustling cattle, intimidating honest settlers. The territorial government has placed a substantial bounty on their capture, dead or alive. You're suggesting we hunt them instead of running? I'm suggesting we end their threat permanently. You know their plans, their methods, their weaknesses. With your knowledge and my skills, we can put them out of business forever." The proposition was audacious, dangerous, and appealing in a way that surprised Cass. For 3 days, she had been a victim, a piece of property to be traded and used. The idea of taking active revenge, of becoming the hunter rather than the hunted, awakened something fierce and determined within her. "What about my uncle?" she asked. "They'll kill him if we move against them." "Will they?" Crowfeather's question was gentle but pointed. "Think about it logically. Your uncle is valuable to them alive. He provides legitimacy to their operation, a front for their activities. Dead, he's worthless. They need him more than he needs them now." The logic was sound, but Cass remained unconvinced. Her uncle's weakness had created this situation, but she couldn't abandon him to face the consequences alone. "There's another consideration," Crowfeather continued. "Dalton's gang is growing bolder, taking bigger risks. Sooner or later, they'll make a mistake that brings the full weight of territorial law enforcement down on them. When that happens, everyone associated with their operation becomes a target. Your uncle is safer if we eliminate the threat now, before it grows beyond control." From their vantage point, they could see the outlaws breaking camp below, loading their wounded onto horses and preparing to depart. The attack had accomplished its immediate purpose. Cass was free, but the larger conflict was just beginning. "How do we start?" she asked, surprising herself with the determination in her voice. Crowfeather smiled, and for the first time, the expression reached his eyes. "We start by evening the odds. Dalton has 5 men left, not counting your uncle, who I suspect won't. Fight for them when the moment comes. I know where they're headed. There's only one place in this territory where they can hole up and treat their wounded safely." "Where?" "Morrison's saloon in Cedar Falls. It's a day's ride west, and Morrison has arrangements with the local sheriff. Dalton thinks he'll be safe there, but he's wrong. That's where we'll end this." As they prepared to leave their rocky fortress, Cass felt a strange sense of liberation. For the first time in days, she was making her own choices, determining her own fate. The frightened girl who had been traded like livestock was gone, replaced by someone harder and more determined. "Why are you helping me?" she asked as they gathered their equipment. "You could have just arrested them and been done with it." Crowfeather paused in securing his rifle to his saddle. "Because some things are worth fighting for, Miss Sterling. Justice, family, the right to choose your own path in life. And because I believe you're strong enough to see this through to the end." As they rode away from the canyon where her captivity had ended, Cass felt the weight of her new reality settling around her. She was no longer just a victim seeking rescue. She had become a participant in a war that would determine not just her own fate, but the future of everyone who had suffered under the outlaws' reign of terror. The game had changed, and for the first time since her uncle's betrayal, Cass Sterling held some of the cards. Cedar Falls had once been a prosperous mining town, but the silver had played out 2 years earlier, leaving behind empty storefronts and the hollow-eyed desperation of people with nowhere else to go. Morrison's Frontier Saloon stood at the heart of what remained, a two-story wooden structure that served as gambling hall, brothel, and unofficial headquarters for every criminal enterprise within 50 miles. Cass and Crow Feather observed the town from a ridge overlooking the main street, using field glasses to study the patterns of movement below. The morning sun cast long shadows between the buildings, creating perfect concealment for anyone who understood how to use them. 11 horses tied outside Morrison's place, Crow Feather noted, adjusting the focus on his glasses. That's more than Dalton's gang. He's called in reinforcements. Through her own glasses, Cass could see armed men positioned at strategic points around the saloon, rooftops, alleyways, even inside the supposedly abandoned buildings across the street. What should have been a straightforward confrontation had become something far more complex. "How many do you count?" she asked, sweeping her glasses across the scene below. "At least 15, maybe 20. Professional guns, not local toughs." Crow Feather lowered his glasses, his expression grim. "Morrison's put out word that there's money to be made protecting Dalton. This isn't just about your uncle's debt anymore. They're making a stand." The realization struck Cass like a physical blow. Their pursuit of justice had somehow escalated into open warfare, drawing in mercenaries and criminals from across the territory. The quiet rescue mission had become something that could reshape the entire region's balance of power. "We can't fight 20 men," she said, stating the obvious. "No, we can't," Crow Feather agreed, "but we don't have to fight all of them at once, and we're not the only ones with an interest in seeing Dalton's operation shut down." He pointed toward the north end of town, where a different group of riders was approaching. Even at a distance, their military bearing was unmistakable: straight backs, disciplined formation, the purposeful movement of men accustomed to following orders. "Cavalry patrol?" Cass asked hopefully. "Better, Territorial Marshal Sam Hartwell and his deputies. I sent word to him 3 days ago about Dalton's location. Looks like he finally decided to investigate. The arrival of legitimate law enforcement should have been cause for celebration, but Cass noted the tension in Crow Feather's posture. "You don't look happy about it. Hartwell's a good man, but he plays by rules that don't apply to men like Dalton. He'll try to arrest them, give them a chance to surrender, follow proper legal procedures. Morrison has the local sheriff in his pocket, and half the territorial judges owe their positions to political connections that favor men with money. You're saying they might walk away from this. I'm saying the law isn't always the same thing as justice." Crow Feather secured his field glasses and began checking his weapons. "Which is why we need to be ready to act if the official approach unveils." As they watched, Marshal Hartwell's 6-man team took positions around the saloon, establishing a loose perimeter that demonstrated professional competence while maintaining the restraint expected of lawmen. Hartwell himself rode directly to the saloon's front entrance, dismounting with the unhurried confidence of a man who had faced down dangerous criminals many times before. "Morrison," his voice carried clearly in the thin mountain air. "This is Marshal Hartwell. I have warrants for the arrest of Marcus Dalton and his associates. Send them out and nobody gets hurt." The response came not from Morrison, but from Dalton himself, who appeared on the saloon's second-story balcony with his hands conspicuously away from his weapons. "Marshal Hartwell, always a pleasure. I'm afraid there's been some misunderstanding. I'm here as Morrison's invited guest, conducting legitimate business." "Legitimate business doesn't usually require 20 armed men," Hartwell replied dryly. "Come down here, Dalton. Let's discuss this misunderstanding in a civilized manner." Cass found herself holding her breath as the confrontation unfolded. Everything depended on the next few minutes, whether this would end in surrender and proper legal proceedings, or whether the fragile veneer of civilization would be stripped away to reveal the brutal reality beneath. "I'd be happy to discuss Things, Dalton called down, but I'm concerned about my safety. Your deputy there, he pointed toward Crowfeather's position on the ridge, has been making threats against my life, shooting at me without provocation. A man has the right to defend himself. Crowfeather cursed under his breath. Dalton had spotted them despite their careful concealment, and worse, he was turning the situation to his advantage by portraying himself as the victim of an unprovoked attack. Jacob Crowfeather is a duly authorized deputy marshal, Hartwell replied, though his voice carried a note of uncertainty. If you have complaints about his conduct, we can address them through proper channels after you surrender to face the charges against you. What charges exactly? This voice came from a new speaker, a well-dressed man who emerged from the saloon to stand beside Dalton on the balcony. Cass didn't recognize him, but his expensive clothing and confident manner suggested legal training. "And you are?" Hartwell asked. "Edward Thornton, attorney at law representing Mr. Dalton and his associates. I'd like to see the warrants you mentioned, Marshal, and I'd like an explanation of why armed men are surrounding my client's location without due process. The arrival of a lawyer changed everything. Suddenly, this was no longer a simple confrontation between law enforcement and criminals. It had become a legal chess match with rules that favored those who could afford expert representation." Hartwell produced a folder of documents, holding them up for inspection. Warrants for armed robbery, cattle rustling, kidnapping, and conspiracy to commit murder. All properly signed by Judge Morrison in Helena. "Judge Morrison." Thornton's voice carried surprise and satisfaction. "I'm afraid Judge Morrison died of a heart attack 4 days ago, Marshal. Any warrants bearing his signature after that date would be questionable." Cass felt her heart sink as she realized what was happening. The legal foundation for Dalton's arrest was crumbling before their eyes, destroyed by technicalities and timing that seemed too convenient to be coincidental. "The warrants are valid," Hartwell insisted, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Judge Morrison signed them before his death." "Perhaps," Thornton conceded, "but that would need to be verified through proper legal channels. Until then, my clients are free men, conducting lawful business. Any attempt to detain them without valid warrants would constitute false imprisonment." From their position on the ridge, Crowfeather and Cass watched the situation deteriorate. The criminals were using the very legal system they had spent years undermining to protect themselves from justice. The irony was bitter, but the practical result was clear. Dalton and his gang were going to walk away from this confrontation. "We have to do something," Cass whispered urgently. "If they escape now, they'll disappear into the mountains. We'll never get another chance like this." "What would you suggest?" Crowfeather asked, though his tone suggested he was already considering various options. "Hartwell won't act without proper legal authority, and Dalton's lawyer is giving him reasons to hesitate. Then we give Hartwell something he can't ignore, evidence that makes those warrants valid regardless of technicalities." Crowfeather turned to study her face, seeing something there that hadn't existed before their partnership began. "What kind of evidence?" "The kind that proves Dalton's current crimes, not past ones. Something that happens right here, right now, in front of witnesses." Cass was already moving, sliding backward from their observation point toward the horses they had concealed in a grove of aspens. "Where are you going?" Crowfeather demanded, following her with growing alarm. "To end this," she replied, her voice carrying a cold determination that reminded him uncomfortably of professional killers he had known. "Dalton made one mistake. He thinks I'm helpless because I'm a woman. Time to prove him wrong." Before Crowfeather could stop her, Cass had mounted her horse and was riding toward the town's back streets, following a route that would bring her to the saloon's rear entrance without being seen by the men watching the front. Her plan was audacious, dangerous, and completely insane. Exactly the kind of unexpected move that might succeed where conventional tactics had failed. Crowfeather had no choice but to follow, positioning himself to provide cover fire if her desperate gambit went wrong. As he watched her disappear into the maze of abandoned buildings behind the saloon, he found himself remembering his mother's words about the unpredictability of cornered prey. Sometimes, she had told him, the most dangerous opponent was the one who had nothing left to lose. Cass tied her horse behind the old assay office and approached the saloon on foot, using the network of alleys and back doors she had studied during their surveillance. The building's rear entrance was guarded by a single man, one of the local toughs Morrison had recruited rather than a professional gunman. He was more interested in the confrontation happening out front than in watching for threats from behind. She approached him directly, making no attempt at stealth. "Excuse me," she called softly, affecting the helpless tone she had perfected during her captivity. "Could you help me? I'm lost." The guard turned, his expression shifting from suspicion to lecherous interest as he took in her appearance. Like most men in his profession, he saw women as either threats or opportunities, and Cass had deliberately presented herself as the latter. Well, he leered, stepping away from his post. "What's a pretty little thing like you doing in a place like this?" "I was traveling with my father's wagon train," Cass replied, moving closer while keeping her hands visible and unthreatening. "We got separated, and I've been wandering for days. I'm so scared and hungry." The guard relaxed completely, his weapon remaining holstered as he focused on what he considered more pleasant possibilities. "Don't you worry, miss. Old Pete will take good care of you, real good care." When he reached for her, Cass was ready. The knife she had concealed in her sleeve found its way into her hand with practiced ease, a skill learned during 3 years of preparing meals at the trading post, now adapted to a more deadly purpose. The blade slid between Pete's ribs with surgical precision, angled upward to pierce his heart. He died without making a sound, his body slumping against the saloon's back wall. Cass felt no satisfaction in the killing, only grim determination. Pete had chosen his profession knowing the risks involved, and she had chosen hers. The difference was that her cause was just, while his was merely profitable. She dragged the body into the shadows and took his position by the door, listening to the voices from inside the saloon. Through the thin walls, she could hear Dalton and his lawyer continuing their legal maneuvering with Marshal Hartwell, buying time while their hired guns maintained their positions around the building. The rear door opened onto a storage room, filled with whiskey barrels and gambling supplies. Beyond that lay the saloon's main floor, where she could hear the murmur of voices and the occasional clink of glass. More importantly, she could hear Dalton's voice coming from directly above. He was still on the second-floor balcony, addressing the marshal, while his men held their positions. The wooden stairs to the second floor were old and creaky, requiring careful placement of each step to avoid detection. Cass climbed slowly, testing each board before committing her full weight, her knife ready in case she encountered another guard. The hallway at the top was dimly lit and empty, lined with doors that led to the rooms Morrison rented by the hour to his less discriminating customers. Through an open window at the hall's end, she could see Dalton's back as he continued his conversation with the marshal below. The lawyer stood beside him, occasionally offering legal observations that further complicated the situation. Neither man was armed with anything more threatening than words, but Cass knew that would change the moment they realized their position had been compromised. She moved to the window, remaining in the shadows, while positioning herself where both men could see her clearly when they turned around. Then she spoke, her voice cutting through their legal discussion like a blade through silk. "Marshal Hartwell, my name is Cassandra Sterling. I'm the woman these men kidnapped from my uncle's trading post 3 days ago. I can provide testimony about their crimes, including the murder I just witnessed them commit." Both Dalton and Thornton spun around, their faces registering shock at her unexpected appearance. Dalton's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but stopped when he saw the knife in Cass's hand and the blood still staining the blade. "That's impossible," Thornton sputtered. "My clients have been conducting legitimate business." "Your clients forced me to accompany them at gunpoint after my uncle was coerced into a rigged poker game," Cass interrupted, her voice carrying clearly to the marshal and his men below. "I escaped yesterday morning during an attack by Deputy Crowfeather, but not before witnessing Marcus Dalton personally execute a prospector who recognized him from a wanted poster." The lie came easily, delivered with the conviction of truth. There had been no such execution, but Dalton couldn't deny it without admitting to his other crimes, and Thornton couldn't contradict testimony he hadn't been present to witness. "She's lying," Dalton said, but his voice lacked conviction. More importantly, his hand was still hovering near his gun, a gesture that every lawman below could see clearly. "Are you calling me a liar, Mr. Dalton?" Cass asked sweetly, stepping further into the light where the marshal could see her clearly. "The same way you called the poker game that won me fair and square?" It was the final provocation Dalton couldn't resist. His temper, already strained by the legal maneuvering and unexpected complications, finally snapped. His gun cleared leather with the practiced speed of a professional killer. But Cass was already moving, throwing herself sideways as the shot rang out. The bullet splintered the window frame where she had been standing, and suddenly the delicate legal situation below exploded into violence. Marshal Hartwell and his deputies had just witnessed an armed outlaw attempting to murder a witness in broad daylight. Exactly the kind of unambiguous crime that made warrants and legal technicalities irrelevant. "Take them!" Hartwell shouted, drawing his own weapon as his men responded to the clear threat. The careful perimeter they had established around the saloon tightened into an assault formation, and the morning air filled with gunfire as Dalton's hired guns realized their employer's legal protection had just evaporated. From her position on the second floor, Cass could see the battle unfolding below with tactical clarity that surprised her. Hartwell's men were outnumbered but better disciplined, using cover effectively while maintaining coordinated fire. Dalton's mercenaries had superior numbers but lacked cohesion, each man fighting independently rather than as part of a unified strategy. The tide turned when Crowfeather entered the fight from his position on the ridge. His rifle spoke with deadly precision, picking off the hired guns who had positioned themselves in the surrounding buildings. Each shot eliminated a threat while avoiding the risk of hitting the marshal's men, demonstrating the kind of tactical awareness that came from years of military experience. Thornton, the lawyer who had seemed so confident moments earlier, was now crouched behind an overturned table, his expensive suit torn and his face pale with terror. The legal niceties that had protected his clients were useless against flying bullets, and he was discovering that words carried little weight in situations where survival depended on more practical skills. Dalton himself had taken cover behind the balcony's wooden railing, returning fire at the marshal's men while shouting orders to his scattered gang. But his position was exposed, and Cass realized she had an opportunity to end the threat he represented permanently. The knife in her hand was balanced for throwing, a skill her father had taught her during their hunting trips before his death. The distance was manageable, the target was stationary, and there would never be a better moment to strike. She drew back her arm, feeling the familiar weight of the blade, preparing to throw. But as she took aim, a different voice cut through. The chaos, a voice she hadn't heard in days but would recognize anywhere. "Cassie, Cassie, where are you?" Her uncle Jeremiah was calling from somewhere below, his voice carrying the desperate urgency of a man facing imminent death. Somehow, he had made it to Cedar Falls, probably following the same trail she and Crowfeather had used. And now he was walking directly into the middle of a gunfight, searching for the niece he had betrayed, but apparently still loved. Cass hesitated, her throw forgotten as she processed this new complication. Her uncle's presence changed everything about the tactical situation, introducing an innocent party who needed protection rather than another enemy to eliminate. The simple revenge she had planned was becoming something far more complex, requiring choices she hadn't anticipated and wasn't prepared to make. Below her, the gunfight raged on, but she was no longer focused on ending Dalton's life. Instead, she found herself calculating how to save the man who had caused all this suffering while still achieving the justice she and Crow Feather had set out to deliver. The game had changed again, and Cass Sterling was discovering that victory often came with a price she hadn't expected to pay. The explosion that rocked Cedar Falls came without warning, turning the morning air into a maelstrom of fire and splintered wood. Morrison's saloon, which had stood as the center of criminal enterprise for 2 years, disappeared in a pillar of flame that could be seen from 20 miles away. The blast threw everyone, lawmen and outlaws alike, to the ground, temporarily ending the gunfight in a shower of burning debris. Cass found herself on the second floor of what remained of the building's frame, clinging to a beam that had somehow survived the destruction. Through the smoke and flames below, she could see figures moving, some trying to escape, others lying ominously still. The careful battle lines that had existed moments before had been obliterated along with most of the building. "Cassie!" Her uncle's voice cut through the chaos, closer now but desperate with fear. "Cassie, answer me." She tried to call back, but smoke filled her lungs, turning her response into a fit of coughing that left her gasping for breath. The fire was spreading rapidly through what remained of the structure, and she realized with growing alarm that her position was becoming untenable. The beam she was clinging to creaked ominously, weakened by the blast, and now bearing weight it was never designed to support. Through the flames, she glimpsed a figure moving with purposeful urgency through the wreckage. Crow Feather, his buckskin shirt singed but his movements still controlled and efficient. He was pulling survivors away from the burning debris, making no distinction between lawmen and criminals in his rescue efforts. It was exactly the kind of behavior she had come to expect from him, honor superseding convenience even in the midst of chaos. "Jacob," she called, her voice barely audible over the roar of flames. "Up here!" He looked up, his eyes widening as he saw her precarious position. Without hesitation, he began climbing through the wreckage, using the same natural agility that had made him such an effective scout. But even his skills had limits, and the fire was spreading faster than he could climb. "The beam won't hold," he shouted up to her. "You have to jump." The distance to the ground was at least 15 feet, with burning debris scattered across what had once been the saloon's main floor. A fall onto the wrong piece of wreckage could mean broken bones or worse. But staying where she was meant certain death as the fire consumed what remained of the building's structure. Before she could make the decision, it was made for her. The beam gave way with a sharp crack, sending her tumbling through the air toward the inferno below. Time seemed to slow as she fell, her mind registering the positions of debris, the location of flames, the expression of desperate concern on Crow Feather's face as he positioned himself to break her fall. They hit the ground together in a tangle of limbs, his body cushioning her impact while taking the full force of the collision himself. For a moment, neither moved, both stunned by the violence of their descent. Then the reality of their situation reasserted itself. They were lying in the middle of a burning building, and escape was the only priority that mattered. Crow Feather struggled to his feet, one arm hanging awkwardly at his side where the fall had dislocated his shoulder. "Can you walk?" he asked through gritted teeth. Cass tested her legs, finding them bruised but functional. "Better than you can, from the look of it," she replied, moving to support his injured side. "Come on. We need to get out of here before the whole place Comes down, they made their way through the wreckage toward what had once been the front entrance, stepping carefully around burning beams and twisted metal. The heat was becoming unbearable, and smoke made breathing difficult, but they pressed forward with the determination of people who had already survived too much to die in a building fire. As they emerged into the street, the full scope of the disaster became apparent. The explosion had damaged every building within a 2-block radius, shattering windows and collapsing roofs throughout the center of town. Bodies lay scattered in the dust, some moving, others terrifyingly still. The neat divisions between law, enforcement, and criminals had been erased by indiscriminate destruction. Marshal Hartwell sat propped against a water trough, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead, while one of his deputies worked to bandage the wound. 3 of his men were unaccounted for, presumably buried somewhere in the rubble that had been Morrison's establishment. The careful law enforcement operation had become a rescue mission, with survival taking precedence over arrests. "What the hell happened?" Hartwell asked as Cass and Crow Feather approached. "That wasn't gunpowder. That was something else entirely." "Dynamite," replied a voice from behind them. They turned to see Dalton emerging from the ruins of the general store. Across the street, his expensive clothing torn and blackened, but his cold eyes as calculating as ever. Morrison kept a case of mining explosives in the saloon's basement. Stray bullet must have found it. The outlaw leader's survival seemed almost supernatural, given the violence of the explosion. But as Cass studied his position, she realized he had been thrown clear of the blast, landing in the only spot that offered protection from the flying debris. Even in disaster, Marcus Dalton's luck held strong. "You're under arrest," Hartwell said automatically, though his voice lacked conviction. His deputies were scattered or injured, his position was compromised, and the legal justification for the arrest had literally gone up in smoke, along with the building where the crimes had allegedly occurred. For what? Dalton's lawyer, Thornton, appeared beside his client, looking remarkably composed for someone who had just survived an explosion. "My client was conducting legitimate business when your assault began. Any deaths or injuries are the result of your unprovoked attack on a peaceful establishment." The legal maneuvering resumed even amid the destruction, demonstrating the persistence of bureaucracy in the face of human catastrophe, but Cass was no longer listening to the exchange. Her attention was fixed on a figure stumbling through the smoke and debris, calling her name with increasing desperation. "Uncle Jeremiah," she whispered, recognizing his distinctive silhouette despite the chaos surrounding them. Her uncle looked older than she remembered, his face gaunt with worry, and his clothes travel-stained from what must have been a hard ride to reach Cedar Falls. When he saw her standing beside Crow Feather, relief and guilt warred across his features in equal measure. "Cassie, thank God," he breathed, moving toward her with outstretched arms. "When I heard the explosion, I thought you might be—" "I'm alive, no thanks to you," she replied, her voice carrying none of the warmth he was hoping for. "What are you doing here?" "I came to get you back," Jeremiah said, his voice breaking with emotion. "I know what I did was wrong. I know I betrayed your trust, your father's memory, everything decent I should have stood for. But I couldn't live with it. I had to try to make things right." The reunion she had dreamed of during her captivity was nothing like she had imagined. Instead of relief and forgiveness, she felt only a cold anger that had been building since the moment she learned of his betrayal. The man before her was weak, selfish, and responsible for everything that had happened. Since that terrible night at the trading post. "Make things right," she repeated, her voice rising with suppressed fury. "Do you have any idea what you cost me, what you cost both of us? I've killed a man, Uncle. I've seen things, done things that will haunt me for the rest of my life. All because you couldn't control your gambling." Jeremiah flinched as if she had struck him, but he didn't retreat. I know what my weakness has cost you. But I'm here now, and I have money. Real money this time. I sold the trading post, everything. We owned. It's enough to pay Dalton what I owe him with interest." The statement hung in the air like another explosion, its implications rippling through everyone present. Cass stared at her uncle in disbelief, trying to process what he had just revealed. He had sold their home, their livelihood, their father's legacy, everything that mattered to her, in order to raise money for a debt that had already cost them far too much. "You sold the trading post," she said slowly, as if testing the words for reality. "You sold our home." "It was the only way," Jeremiah pleaded. "The only way to get enough money quickly. I found a buyer in Helena, a mining company that wants to use the location for a supply depot. They paid cash, full value." "Full value," Cass repeated, her voice becoming dangerously quiet. "And what did you think I would do? Where did you think I would live? What did you think would become of me once you cleared your precious debt?" The questions hung between them, like accusations, each one highlighting the selfish desperation that had driven his decision. Jeremiah had thought only of his immediate problem, not of the consequences his solution would create for the niece who had already sacrificed so much for his failures. I hoped we could start over somewhere else," he stammered. "Find a new place, build a new life, together." Together. Cass laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "The way we've been together for the past 3 years, with you drinking and gambling while I held everything together, that kind of partnership." Dalton had been listening to the family reunion with obvious interest, recognizing opportunity in the emotional chaos surrounding him. "Touching as this reconciliation is," he interrupted, "Mr. Sterling's offer is worth considering. $1,500 would clear his debt and interest, allowing everyone to walk away from this unfortunate situation." "The deal has changed," Crowfeather interjected, his voice carrying a dangerous edge despite his obvious pain from his dislocated shoulder. "Murder, kidnapping, conspiracy, the charges go far beyond a simple gambling debt now." "What murder?" Thornton demanded. "What? Kidnapping. You'll find it difficult to prove crimes that existed only in the imagination of a traumatized young woman seeking revenge against men she blames for her uncle's personal failures." The lawyer's dismissive tone ignited something violent in Cass's chest. After everything she had endured, everything she had witnessed and done, to have her experiences reduced to the fantasies of a hysterical female was more than she could bear. "Traumatized," she said, her voice carrying a deadly calm that made everyone present take an unconscious step backward. "You want to see what trauma looks like?" Before anyone could react, she had drawn the knife she had taken from the dead guard, its blade still stained with blood from her earlier kill. But instead of threatening Thornton or Dalton, she turned toward her uncle, the weapon held with steady purpose. "This is what your gambling has created," she told Jeremiah, her eyes never leaving his face. "This is what I've become because of your weakness. I've killed for the first time in my life, and I felt nothing but satisfaction when I watched him die. Your precious debt has turned me into something I never wanted to be." The knife moved closer to Jeremiah's throat, close enough that everyone could see the thin line of blood where the blade touched skin. Marshal Hartwell started to move, but Crowfeather raised his good hand in a gesture that stopped him. "This is between family," the Half-Comanche scout said quietly. "She's earned the right to settle this her own way." "Cassie, please," Jeremiah whispered, tears streaming down his weathered face. "I know I failed you. I know I'm weak and selfish, and everything you say I am, but killing me won't change what's already happened. It won't bring back what we've lost." "No," Cass agreed, the knife steady at his throat, "but it might prevent you from destroying anyone else's life the way you've destroyed mine." For a long moment, the only sounds were the crackling of flames from the burning buildings and the labored breathing of injured men. Everyone present understood they were witnessing something that would define not just the relationship between uncle and niece, but the kind of justice that would prevail in this harsh land. Then, slowly, Cass lowered the knife. "You're not worth it," she said, her voice carrying a finality that was somehow more devastating than violence would have been. "You're not worth becoming the kind of person who kills family, no matter how much they deserve it." She turned away from Jeremiah, facing Dalton and his lawyer with renewed purpose. "But you are." The threat was clear, and both men recognized it. Thornton's legal maneuvering and Dalton's reputation for violence meant nothing in the face of someone who had already crossed the line between civilization and brutality. They were facing a woman who had learned to kill and found herself disturbingly good at it. "Now see here," Thornton began, but his protests were cut short by a new voice entering the conversation. "Nobody's killing anybody else today, Sheriff." Ben Crawford of Cedar Falls emerged from the smoke, his badge gleaming despite the soot that covered his clothes. Behind him came 6 armed deputies, their weapons drawn but not yet aimed at anyone in particular. Crawford was a large man with intelligent eyes and the kind of presence that commanded attention without requiring violence to back it up. "Sheriff Crawford," Marshal Hartwell said with obvious relief, "glad to see you survived the explosion." "Barely," Crawford replied, his gaze taking in the scene before him with practiced assessment. "Lost 2 good deputies in that blast, and half my jail is buried under rubble. But I'm still the law in this town, and I won't have executions carried out in my streets, regardless of who thinks they deserve it." His attention fixed on Cass, noting the bloody knife in her hand and the wild look in her eyes. "Miss, I don't know what's happened to you, but I can see you've been through hell. That doesn't give you the right to create more of it." "These men kidnapped me," Cass said, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had told this story too many times. "They held me prisoner, threatened my life, destroyed my family. The law has had its chance to deal with them, and it's failed." "The law hasn't failed," Crawford replied firmly. "It's just getting started. Marcus Dalton, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit arson, destruction of property, and endangering public safety. The explosion that destroyed my town happened during your confrontation with federal marshals, making you responsible for the consequences. It was a masterful legal maneuver, using the destruction itself as evidence of criminal behavior rather than relying on the disputed charges that had brought the marshals to Cedar Falls in the first place." Dalton's face darkened as he realized his legal protection had evaporated along with Morrison's saloon. "You can't prove I caused that explosion," he protested. "I can prove you were here conducting illegal activities when it happened," Crawford replied. "That's enough for now. We'll sort out the rest once we get this mess cleaned up and my jail rebuilt." But even as victory seemed within reach, new complications arose. The sound of approaching horses echoed through the damaged town, and everyone turned to see a large group of riders coming down the main street. These weren't lawmen or local residents. They were hard-faced men with the look of professional fighters, all armed and moving with the purposeful coordination of a military unit. "Reinforcements," Dalton said with satisfaction, his confidence returning. "I sent word yesterday for additional security. Looks like my message got through." 30 mounted men were riding toward the center of town, enough firepower to overwhelm the scattered law enforcement officers and take control of the situation by force. The legal victory that had seemed so close moments before was about to be swept away by superior numbers and overwhelming violence. Cass looked at the approaching riders, then at the injured lawman, then at her uncle counting out money with shaking hands. Everything they had fought for, everything they had risked and sacrificed, was about to be lost to the simple mathematics of armed conflict. The game had changed one final time, and it appeared that the Outlaws held all the winning cards. But As she watched the riders approach, Cass Sterling made a decision that would define not just her own future, but the future of everyone in Cedar Falls. The frightened girl who had been traded like livestock was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that sometimes justice required more than law enforcement could provide. The final battle was about to begin, and this time there would be no compromise. The thundering hooves that shook the ground belonged not to Dalton's reinforcements, but to something far more unexpected. As the dust cloud approached Cedar Falls, the distinctive sound of military bugles cut through the morning air, followed by the disciplined rhythm of cavalry in formation. What Dalton had mistaken for hired guns was actually the 3rd Montana Cavalry Regiment, responding to smoke signals that had been rising from the mountains since dawn. Cass looked up at the ridge where she and Crow Feather had first observed the town, seeing now what she had missed before, thin columns of smoke rising in a pattern too regular to be natural. Someone had been sending messages in the traditional Comanche way, calling for help in a language older than any territorial law. "My grandfather," Crow Feather said quietly, his injured arm pressed against his side. "He's been watching from the mountains since we arrived. The smoke signals are his work. Your grandfather is alive?" Cass asked, remembering the stories Crow Feather had told about his mixed heritage, very much alive and very traditional in his methods. He doesn't trust white man's justice, but he understands the value of white man's cavalry when the odds are unfavorable. The lead rider who approached was a colonel in full-dress uniform, his bearing suggesting both military competence and political sophistication. Behind him rode 2 full companies of cavalry, nearly 200 men armed with the latest military equipment and trained in tactics that made Dalton's hired guns look like children playing at war. "Colonel Harrison Mitchell," the officer announced as he dismounted, his aide immediately taking his horse's reins. "I received reports of civil unrest threatening territorial stability. Which of you gentlemen is in charge here?" Sheriff Crawford stepped forward, though his authority seemed diminished in the presence of such overwhelming military force. "Sheriff Ben Crawford, Colonel. We have the situation under control, but we'd appreciate assistance with the injured and clean-up efforts." Colonel Mitchell's experienced eye took in the destroyed buildings, scattered bodies, and obvious signs of recent combat. His gaze lingered on Dalton and his remaining men, noting their weapons and defensive positions with the assessment of someone who had spent decades evaluating military threats. "Under control," he repeated dryly. "Sheriff, I count at least 15 dead, a quarter of your town destroyed, and what appears to be 2 armed factions facing off in your main street. If this is control, I'd hate to see chaos." Before Crawford could respond, a new voice cut through the conversation, elderly but carrying undeniable authority. From the ridge above town, a lone figure descended on horseback, moving with the easy grace of someone who had spent a lifetime in the saddle. He was clearly very old, his hair completely white and braided in traditional style, but his posture was straight and his eyes were sharp with intelligence. "Grandfather," Crow Feather said with obvious respect and relief, "I was wondering when you'd make your presence known." The old man dismounted with fluid grace, approaching the gathered crowd, with the confidence of someone who feared neither soldiers nor outlaws. When he spoke, it was in accented but perfectly clear English. "I am Joseph Iron Bear, elder of the Nakoni band, grandfather to this young warrior you call Crow Feather. I have been watching the events in this place, and I have seen much that troubles me." Colonel Mitchell studied the old Comanche with obvious interest. "Mr. Iron Bear, I assume you're the one responsible for the smoke signals that brought us here?" "I am. The old ways are sometimes more reliable than the new ones. Your soldiers came quickly when called properly." Iron Bear's gaze shifted to Dalton and his men. "These men have brought dishonor to this place through their actions. The woman," he gestured toward Cass, has been wronged by them and by her own family. Justice requires that balance be restored. Justice will be handled through proper legal channels, Colonel Mitchell replied, though his tone was respectful rather than dismissive. We have courts, judges, established procedures for dealing with criminal behavior. Iron Bear's weathered, some face creased in what might have been a smile. Your courts failed to prevent this destruction. Your judges failed to protect the innocent. Sometimes the old justice is more reliable than the new, just as the old signals brought help when new methods failed. The philosophical discussion was interrupted by Dalton, who had been listening to the exchange with growing desperation. The arrival of military forces had destroyed his plans for a violent escape, but he still possessed the manipulative skills that had served him throughout his criminal career. "Colonel Mitchell," he called out, affecting the manner of a wronged citizen seeking protection. "I'm Marcus Dalton, a legitimate businessman operating in this territory under proper licenses. These people have been making false accusations against me, and that woman," he pointed at Cass, "has already committed murder in her quest for revenge." The accusation hung in the air like another explosion, its implications rippling through the assembled crowd. Cass felt the weight of every eye upon her, knowing that her earlier killing of the guard could indeed be used against her if Dalton could make his version of events seem credible. "Is this true, miss?" Colonel Mitchell asked, his tone neutral, but his attention focused entirely on her response. Cass straightened, meeting his gaze directly. "I killed a man who was guarding criminals who had kidnapped me. I killed him to escape, and to help bring these outlaws to justice. If that's murder, then so be it." The honesty of her response clearly impressed the colonel, who had undoubtedly dealt with enough liars and political maneuvering to recognize truth when he heard it. But before he could respond, another voice entered the conversation. "She killed. In self-defense and in defense of others," Marshal Hartwell said, struggling to his feet despite his injuries. "I witnessed the entire sequence of events, Colonel. Miss Sterling has been the victim of a criminal conspiracy, not its perpetrator. A conspiracy that began with her uncle's gambling debts," Thornton interjected, still attempting to provide legal cover for his clients. "Whatever crimes may have been committed, they originated from a legitimate business transaction that has been blown out of proportion by vigilante justice." Iron Bear listened to the legal arguments with obvious contempt. Then, with movements so quick they seemed impossible for a man of his age, he drew a traditional Comanche war knife and held it at Thornton's throat. "You speak many words," the old man said conversationally, "but they are empty words that serve only evil. In the old times, we would cut out the tongue of a man who used speech to protect those who harm women and children." "Put the weapon down," Colonel Mitchell ordered, his hand moving toward his sidearm. "I won't tolerate vigilante justice, regardless of the provocation. Will you tolerate legal justice?" Iron Bear asked, not moving the knife but meeting the colonel's gaze steadily. "Will your courts punish these men for their crimes? Or will clever words and political connections allow them to escape consequences once again?" The question went to the heart of everything that had happened in Cedar Falls. Everyone present understood that traditional legal proceedings might indeed allow Dalton and his associates to escape punishment, particularly if they could afford skilled representation and political influence. Colonel Mitchell was silent for a long moment, clearly wrestling with competing obligations. As a military officer, he was sworn to uphold territorial law and maintain civil order. But as a man who had spent years fighting for frontier justice, he understood the limitations of legal systems in dealing with sophisticated criminals. "Mr. Iron Bear," he said finally, "I give you my word as an officer and a gentleman that justice will be done. Not the partial justice of bought judges and corrupt officials, but real justice that serves the innocent and punishes the guilty." "Your word?" Iron Bear asked, lowering his knife slightly but not sheathing it. What is the word of a white soldier worth to those who have been betrayed by white laws? It's worth everything I have, Mitchell replied simply. My honor, my career, my life if necessary. These men will face trial for their crimes, and I will personally ensure that their wealth and connections don't protect them from the consequences of their actions. The promise carried weight because of the man making it. Colonel Mitchell's reputation for integrity was known throughout the territory, and his willingness to stake his career on ensuring justice was not a gesture he would make lightly. Iron Bear studied the colonel's face for several heartbeats, then slowly returned his knife to its sheath. I will hold you to this promise, soldier, and if your justice fails, then Comanche justice will follow. With the immediate threat of violence diffused, attention turned to the practical matters of dealing with the aftermath of the day's events. Dalton and his surviving men were placed under military custody, their weapons confiscated and their movements restricted pending formal charges. Thornton found himself facing potential disbarment proceedings for his role in obstructing justice. His legal expertise suddenly turned against him. But for Cass, the resolution of the immediate crisis only highlighted the larger questions about her future. With the trading post sold and her uncle's betrayal still fresh in her mind, she faced the prospect of starting over with nothing except the clothes on her back and the bitter knowledge of what family loyalty was really worth. "What will you do now?" Crowfeather asked, as they stood together watching the cavalry organize the prisoners and tend to the wounded. His shoulder had been reset by the military medic, but his arm remained in a sling, a visible reminder of the price they had both paid for justice. "I don't know," Cass admitted. "I have no home, no family I can trust, no prospects for supporting myself. 3 days ago, I was a respectable woman managing a legitimate business. Now, I'm a killer with blood on my hands and nowhere to go." "You could come with me," Crowfeather said quietly. "The Territorial Marshal Service is expanding, and they need people with your skills and knowledge. You understand criminal behavior now, understand how men like Dalton think and operate. That knowledge could be valuable in preventing others from suffering what you've endured." The suggestion was both appealing and terrifying. The idea of becoming a law enforcement officer, of using her experiences to help others, offered purpose to the trauma she had survived. But it also meant accepting that the gentle life she had known was gone forever, replaced by something harder and more dangerous. "A woman marshal?" she asked. "The territorial government would never approve such an appointment." "Not a marshal," Crowfeather explained. "A consultant, an investigator, someone who works with law enforcement without being bound by all the same restrictions. There's precedent for such positions, especially when dealing with crimes that cross territorial boundaries." Colonel Mitchell, overhearing their conversation, approached with obvious interest. "Miss Sterling, if I may make a suggestion, the Army is establishing a new intelligence division focused on criminal organizations that threaten territorial stability. Someone with your recent experiences and demonstrated capabilities would be invaluable in such work." The offer was unexpected and intriguing. It would mean steady employment, official protection, and the opportunity to ensure that what had happened to her didn't happen to others. More importantly, it would give her a purpose that went beyond simple survival. "What about my uncle?" she asked, glancing toward Jeremiah, who sat alone on the steps of the damaged general store, counting and recounting the money he had brought to pay his debts. "That's your decision to make," Iron Bear said, having approached silently as was his habit. "In Comanche tradition, family members who betray the tribe are cast out, no longer considered blood relatives, but you are not Comanche, and your traditions may be different." Cass walked over to where her uncle sat, studying the man who had raised her for 3 years and nearly destroyed her life in a single night of gambling. He looked up as she approached, his eyes red with tears and exhaustion. "Cassie," he began, "I know I can never make up for what I've done, but the money, keep it," she said simply. "Use it to start over somewhere else, somewhere far from here. Find a place where people don't know what you've done, and try to become the man my father thought you were." "What about you?" Jeremiah asked. "What about us? We're family, Cassie. Despite everything, we're still family." Cass was quiet for a long moment, considering her response. When she spoke, her voice was gentle but final. "No, Uncle, we're not family anymore. Family protects each other, sacrifices for each other, stands together against the world. You chose gambling over family. You chose strangers over blood. That choice ended our relationship forever." She turned to walk away, then paused. "But I won't see you starve or freeze. Take the money, take what's left of your dignity, and build something decent with it, if you can." Jeremiah nodded slowly, understanding that he was receiving more mercy than he deserved. As Cass walked back toward Crow Feather and the others, he began gathering his belongings, preparing for a journey that would take him far from Montana territory and the wreckage of his previous life. "So what's your decision?" Colonel Mitchell asked as Cass rejoined the group. "The offer stands, but I'll need an answer soon. There's a stage to Helena tomorrow, and from there you could travel to Denver for training in investigative techniques." Cass looked around at the destroyed town, the injured men, the prisoners awaiting trial. Everything familiar in her life had been destroyed or transformed beyond recognition. But from that destruction, new possibilities were emerging, opportunities to make a difference, to prevent others from suffering as she had suffered. "I accept," she said firmly, "on one condition." "Which is?" "Jacob Crow Feather works as my partner. His skills complement mine, and we function well as a team. If the territorial government wants my services, they get both of us." Crow Feather smiled, the expression reaching his eyes for the first time since she had known him. "I accept the partnership if the Army will have us both," Colonel Mitchell nodded approvingly. "The Army will be fortunate to have you both. You'll receive official appointments within the week, along with credentials and equipment appropriate to your new roles." As the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the damaged town, Cass Sterling stood beside her, new partner, and contemplated the future. The frightened girl who had been gambled away to outlaws was gone forever, replaced by a woman who understood both the price of justice and the cost of its absence. 3 days earlier, she had been property, to be traded. Now she was a federal agent with the authority to hunt down men like Dalton and ensure they faced appropriate consequences for their crimes. The transformation was complete and irreversible. "No regrets?" Crow Feather asked as they watched the cavalry prepare camp for the night. "Only one," Cass replied. "I regret that it took so long for me to discover who I really was, underneath all the expectations and limitations others placed on me." Iron Bear overheard her response and nodded with approval. "In Comanche tradition, we say that a person's true name can only be earned through testing. You have been tested, granddaughter of my spirit, and you have earned a name worthy of respect." "What name is that?" she asked curiously. The old man smiled, his weathered face creasing with genuine warmth. "She who brings justice. It is a name that will be remembered long after the men who wronged you are forgotten." As night fell over Cedar Falls, bringing the first day of her new life to a close, Cassandra Sterling accepted her earned name and the responsibilities that came with it. The game that had begun with a rigged poker hand had finally ended, but the players who remained standing were not the ones anyone would have predicted. Justice, it seemed, had its own way of dealing the final cards. The morning sun painted the Rocky Mountains in shades of gold and crimson as Cassandra Sterling, now officially Special Agent Sterling of the Territorial Criminal Investigation Division, reviewed the case files spread across her hotel room table. The wanted posters and witness statements told a familiar story. Another gang preying on isolated settlements, another group of criminals who believed their remote location made them untouchable. A year had passed since the destruction of Cedar Falls and the end of Marcus Dalton's reign of terror. 12 months of hunting down the territory's most dangerous criminals had transformed Cass from a novice investigator into one of the most respected agents in federal service. Her partnership with Jacob Crow Feather had become legendary among law enforcement circles, the mixed-blood scout and the rancher's daughter who had revolutionized how territorial crime was investigated and prosecuted. A soft knock at her door interrupted her review of the evidence. "Come in, Jacob," she called without looking up, recognizing the distinctive pattern of his approach. Crowfeather entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee and moving with the easy confidence that had become his trademark. His arm had healed completely from the Cedar Falls incident, leaving only a thin scar as a reminder of their first case together. Like Cass, he'd grown into his role as a federal agent, though he still preferred buckskin and traditional weapons alongside his official credentials. "The local sheriff just arrived," he reported, settling into the chair across from her. "Sheriff, Martinez seems competent, but he's dealing with the same problems we've seen everywhere else. Too much territory, too few men, and criminals who know how to exploit the gaps in coverage." Cass accepted her coffee gratefully, noting the precise way Crow Feather had prepared it, exactly as she preferred, a small gesture that spoke to the depth of their partnership. Over the past year, they had developed an almost telepathic understanding of each other's methods and preferences, making them devastatingly effective as an investigative team. "How many families has the Valdez gang hit so far?" she asked, returning her attention to the case files. 7 confirmed attacks, probably more that haven't been reported yet. They're following the same pattern we've seen before. Isolated homesteads, minimal resistance, maximum intimidation. But there's something different about this operation. Cass looked up, recognizing the tone that indicated Crow Feather had noticed something others had missed. "Different how?" "Too organized, too systematic. Most outlaw gangs are opportunistic. They hit targets of convenience and move on. Valdez is selecting specific properties, studying his victims' routines, timing his attacks for maximum psychological impact. It suggests military training or at least someone with strategic planning experience." The analysis was typical of their partnership. Cass's understanding of criminal psychology combined with Crow Feather's tactical expertise to create insights that neither could achieve alone. Their success rate in capturing wanted criminals had reached nearly 90%, earning them assignments to the territory's most challenging cases. "Any word from Colonel Mitchell about additional resources?" she asked. "He's sending a telegraph today. The army is stretched thin, with Indian conflicts in the south, but he's committed to supporting our operations. We should have a cavalry detachment available if we need backup." The mention of Colonel Mitchell brought back memories of Cedar Falls and the promise he had made to ensure justice prevailed over political connections. He had kept that promise spectacularly. Marcus Dalton had been convicted on all charges and was currently serving 25 years in the territorial prison at Deer Lodge. His lawyer, Thornton, had been disbarred and faced his own criminal charges for obstruction of justice. Bull Morrison, surprisingly, had survived the saloon explosion, but emerged from the wreckage a changed man. The near-death experience had apparently triggered a religious conversion, and he now ran a legitimate boarding house in Billings, reportedly giving generously to local charities and refusing to serve alcohol on his premises. Redemption, Cass had learned, sometimes came from the most unexpected sources. "What about personal matters?" Crowfeather asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Any word from your uncle?" Cass set down her coffee cup, considering how to respond. Jeremiah's letters arrived every few months, guilt-ridden missives from various towns across Colorado and Wyoming, each one describing his attempts to build an honest life and his regret over past failures. She read them but never replied, maintaining the emotional distance that had allowed her to move forward. He's in Denver now, working as a bookkeeper for a mining supply company. Apparently, he's been sober for 8 months and has joined a church. She paused, then added, I hope he finds whatever peace he's looking for, but it won't be with me. Crowfeather nodded understandingly. They had discussed the complexities of family loyalty many times during their travels, and he respected her decision to forge her own path without the burden of past betrayals. Speaking of family, he said, producing a letter from his jacket, Grandfather sent word about the tribal council meetings. They're formally establishing a liaison office in Helena to work with territorial authorities on boundary disputes and criminal matters affecting both communities. Iron Bear would be perfect for that position, Cass observed. He has the respect of both communities and the diplomatic skills to navigate political complications. He's too old for such responsibilities, according to him, but he's recommending someone else for the position. Crowfeather's expression remained carefully neutral, but Cass could sense underlying significance in his words. Who? Me. The council believes my experience with federal law enforcement makes me an ideal candidate to represent tribal interests while maintaining cooperative relationships with territorial authorities. The news should have been cause for celebration. It was a significant honor and would place Crowfeather in a position to help his people while continuing his law enforcement career. But Cass felt a sudden hollowness in her chest as she realized what the appointment would mean for their partnership. It's an important position, she said carefully. You'd be able to make a real difference for your people. I would, but it would mean ending our current partnership. The liaison position is based in Helena, dealing primarily with political and administrative matters rather than field investigations. They sat in silence for several minutes, both understanding the implications of the opportunity. Their partnership had become more than professional over the past year. They had developed a trust and understanding that went beyond mere cooperation. The idea of working alone again, after experiencing the effectiveness of their collaboration, seemed almost unthinkable. What are you going to tell them? Cass asked finally. Crowfeather was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the mountains that had shaped both their lives. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of careful consideration. I'm going to recommend they find someone else for the liaison position, someone with political ambitions and a taste for administrative work. I prefer hunting criminals to filing reports, and I prefer working with a partner who understands my methods. Relief flooded through Cass, though she tried to keep it from showing in her expression. Are you sure? It's a chance to help your people directly, to address the kinds of injustices you've seen throughout your life. I am helping my people, Crowfeather replied. Every criminal we capture, every corrupt official we expose, every family we protect from predators like Dalton, that's all helping to build a territory where justice applies equally to everyone, regardless of their background. He stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the landscape they had both learned to call home. Besides, I've grown attached to this partnership. Someone needs to watch your back when you decide to infiltrate outlaw hideouts single-handedly. Cass laughed, remembering several incidents over the past year where her direct approach to dangerous situations had required Crowfeather's intervention. I prefer to think of it as taking calculated risks in pursuit of justice. You prefer to think of it as being too stubborn to wait for backup, he corrected with amusement, which is why you need a partner who understands your methods and can compensate for your enthusiastic approach to law enforcement. The gentle teasing was familiar and comfortable, part of the easy relationship they had developed over months of dangerous work and shared experiences. But beneath the humor, both understood the deeper truth. They functioned better together than either did alone, complementing each other's strengths while compensating for individual weaknesses. A commotion in the street below drew their attention. To the window, Sheriff Martinez was approaching the hotel with a small group of local citizens, their expressions suggesting urgent business. Cass quickly gathered the case files while Crow Feather checked his weapons, habits developed over a year of responding to emergency situations. "Looks like the Valdez case just became more complicated," she observed, noting the tension in the approaching group's body language. "Or more interesting," Crow Feather replied, settling his gun belt properly. "Ready to see what new challenge the territory has for us?" Cass secured her badge inside her jacket and picked up her hat, feeling the familiar surge of anticipation that came with beginning a new investigation. The frightened girl who had once been traded like livestock was completely gone, replaced by a woman who faced danger with confidence and skill. The transformation was so complete that sometimes she could barely remember the person she had been before Cedar Falls. "Ready," she confirmed, moving toward the door. "Let's go bring some justice to this corner of the territory." As they left the hotel room together, Cass reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. A year ago, she had been a victim of circumstance, powerless to control her own fate. Now she carried federal authority and the skills to protect others from the kinds of predators who had once threatened her own life. The name Iron Bear had given her, she who brings justice, had proven prophetic. In 12 months of federal service, she and Crow Feather had captured or killed 23 wanted criminals, broken up 4 major outlaw organizations, and restored law and order to dozens of communities across the territory. Their success rate was unmatched. Their methods were studied by other law enforcement agencies, and their reputation preceded them wherever they traveled. But more than professional success, Cass had found something she hadn't expected when this journey began, a sense of purpose that went beyond personal survival or revenge. Every criminal they captured meant families who could sleep safely. Every corrupt official they exposed meant honest people could pursue their dreams without fear. Every victory for justice was a blow against the kind of arbitrary power that had once controlled her own destiny. As they stepped into the street to meet Sheriff Martinez and learn about the latest developments in the Valdez case, Cass Sterling, Special Agent Sterling, felt the satisfaction that came from work that mattered. She had found her calling in the most unlikely circumstances, forged from trauma and betrayal, but tempered by courage and partnership. The girl who had been gambled away to outlaws was gone forever. In her place stood a woman who had become exactly what the territory needed, an agent of justice who understood both the price of corruption and the value of redemption. The game that had begun with marked cards had ended with her holding all the winning hands, and she intended to keep playing until justice prevailed throughout the Montana Territory. The sun climbed higher over the mountains as they began their next case, 2 partners united in purpose and tested by fire, ready to face whatever challenges awaited them in the continuing struggle between law and lawlessness on the American frontier. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.